So the aim of my presentation here is to give a greater understanding of the political dynamics and the political risk dynamics involved in Tanzania, because those of you who have followed the market will realise there's been a period of change in the last 2 years, largely attributed to President Magufuli, who came into power in 2015. So I'll try and give you some context as to what the past means, how that impacts the present, and what we think that's going to mean for the future in terms of the private sector and also, of course, investment in the mining sector. So if we look at the past and we look at the recent history of Tanzania, the country's post-colonial stage came with socialist roots, which were entrenched in this idea of ujamaa and socialist origins. We compare that to a country such as Kenya, where the post-colonial years came with an ethnically driven, rampant capitalism system, which actually further segregated and created social fissures between some of the ethnic classes within the country. This socialist origin continues to shape the way in which Tanzanians view the economy, and also the way in which Tanzanians and also the government and key stakeholders view investment, and particularly foreign investment, with regards to what a company should be contributing to the Tanzanian citizens and its economy. If we look at the strategic location of the country, over there with the east, with Indian Ocean to its right, it has a long and stable and safe port system. It's got Dar es Salaam, the newly commissioned Bagamoyo port, and additional ports at Tanga and also Mtwara. It's strategically located in that it's both part of the EAC and also the Southern African Development Community. And then we continue in terms of safety and security. Tanzania has not seen coups. It is a safe country in terms of physical personal safety, and also at the macro level in terms of safety and the trajectory of stability for the long term. If we look at the past in terms of the recent political history and what that means for the country and its growth, the country's political system has been dominated by CCM, which is Chama Mapinduzi, which is the political party of which President Magufuli is a member. They have won since the introduction of multi-party politics in the 90s, every successive election. So it could be classified as a dominant party state, which on the one hand brings a consistency to some extent in terms of decision-making and ideology. The elections would be considered free and fair, both domestically and by international observers. We've not witnessed a violent regime change in Tanzania's post-colonial history, and we've seen successive instances whereby leaders step down after they're mandated to 5-year terms. The country has relatively strong institutions with a largely independent judiciary and a functioning parliament as well. If we look at what that means in terms of elections and transitions in presidents compared to somewhere like Kenya or the DRC. In Kenya, we often see a downturn in investment in the lead up to an election, and depending on the way in which the election goes, we recently, of course, saw a disputed election result, and in 2007-8, a significant amount of post-election violence, which sees a sort of slowdown in investment in the lead up to it, and a high degree of trepidation for up to 6 months after. We haven't really seen that in the Tanzanian economy. In terms of how government is structured as well, Tanzania has obviously MPs who are elected to represent their constituencies, but also regional commissioners and district commissioners. A fundamental difference of this system vis-a-vis the Kenyan system is regional commissioners and district commissioners are appointed by the president. They therefore have a direct line of access to the president, vis-a-vis somewhere like Kenya, whereby governors are elected on the down ticket and are often in stark contrast to the views of the central government. So from a stakeholder engagement perspective, there's one step removed at the local level, that you can get a degree of consistency from your local stakeholder engagement up to the presidential and cabinet members. If we look at the issue of corruption and ease of doing business in Kenya, Tanzania has had varying degrees of corruption in its post-colonial history. And I would say the Ministry of what was Energy and Minerals, they've since been split into 2 ministries, was viewed, particularly under former President Kikwete, as a ministry where a higher degree of corruption took place. So the Tegeta scandal involving the energy minister was one such instance. That perception is changing, but is still not completely changed in the market. However, the recent decision by President Magufuli to split the ministries into one for energy and one for minerals is going to help in terms of processing, procedures and governance. In terms of Tanzania, it's often been seen, I guess much like Kenya, as a sort of Africa light for investment, a good first stop. The fundamentals are still there for investors to consider Tanzania as Africa light. Long-term stability, strong institutions, low risk around election, and of course the strategic positioning of the country. But in terms of what has changed, we have to look at the president. President Magufuli came to power, although part of the CCM, as a non-establishment figure. He was seen to sort of keep the party together in that he doesn't have a factional backing behind him. Instead, he came as a compromise candidate. The benefits of this is he doesn't owe some of the dues that previous president owed. He doesn't have as many favours to those who got him to his position. Immediately prior to being president, he was a Minister for Works. So he has a strong interest in infrastructure projects and has a high degree of influence and authority over what is now the Ministry of Works, Transport and Communications. It's become a mega ministry. So if we look at the way he can govern and the way he has governed, he doesn't have the favours that he has to pay off in his first few years, and he's also been afforded a degree of autonomy in his decision making that we hadn't previously seen under Presidents Kikwete and Nkapa. He came to power on an anti-corruption drive. This is something which he gained supporters through and something which he's taken a lot of effort in executing in his first 2 years in power. Unlike some other countries, Nigeria comes to mind as an example, whereby an anti-corruption drive by President Buhari was used as a way to get back at political opponents. There's a high degree of consensus that the anti-corruption drive has been even-handed in the way it's been distributed. Both citizens and investors are appreciating the benefits. I mean, the queues and the wait times in terms of doctors are decreasing significantly at the citizen level, whereby ghost workers have since been rooted out of the system. And also, if we look at the mining sector and the private sector, key institutions such as the Ports Authority and the transport linkages are a lot more efficient, and some of those built-in costs that were previously there have been removed. In terms of what the president has meant towards the private sector, and this is where there's been quite a bit of media attention, he has initially, in the need to drum up domestic revenue collection, he embarked on quite an aggressive tax regime. The TRA, being the Revenue Authority, was omnipresent in the first 12 to 18 months, and he also embarked on somewhat of a shoot first, ask questions later, and this increased concern among the private sector. This, in his first 12 to 18 months, was coupled with an unwillingness to constructively engage with the private sector. There was much more of a big man politics at play. He was intent on showing that he was the new man in town and had some public spats with the likes of Shell, Dangote as well, and obviously Acacia in the mining sector. In the last 6 months, however, this has changed. We're seeing the traditional routes of engagement with both the president and the cabinet members being reopened. So the CEO Roundtable, the Tanzania Business Council are all being utilised again as a way of getting messages to the permanent secretaries, key ministers, and to the president himself. In terms of what this means for the mining sector, I referenced before the separation of the ministry of what was the Ministry of Energy and Minerals into the Mining Ministry and the Energy Ministry. And at the moment, with the Energy Ministry being somewhat consumed by the Uganda-Tanzania pipeline and the big LNG project, this separation should help the mining sector in terms of clearing up the backlog and ensuring that there's high degrees of focus among bureaucrats and also of oversight. In terms of, I put it here as understanding the Magufuli way, understanding the president and his thought process. He's taken on himself a highly centralised decision-making process, and he has a high degree of authority and oversight over key ministries than previous presidents did. He surrounded himself by like-minded people. So as a former academic, there are lots of former University of Dar es Salaam staff and lecturers who are now key advisors to the president. So we've seen a few cases where the directives have come from a good place, but the execution is perhaps better on paper, not so much in practice. This has been supplemented by what were considered by some as overly challenging regulatory requirements, and when coupled with the lack of stakeholder engagement, this was creating concerning times in terms of for the private sector. Again, I would say these large changes that happened within the first 18 months of President Magufuli's tenure are now being wound back slightly and recalibrated rather than significant changes coming in. But if we look at the sectors that were largely targeted and impacted by these, they were the sectors which were considered, be it rightly or wrongly, as being overly profitable, and they were the mining sector and also the telco sector. So when we look at the why the mining sector, and I've sort of just answered that then, there was an idea that the contracts that were previously signed, largely under President Mkpa's time, were done so in a way that disproportionately favoured the private sector. This, when added with a legacy of distrust within the ministry itself, meant that the mining sector has had some challenges over the last 12 to 18 months under the current president. So in terms of what happened, and I'm sure you would have seen some news articles over the last 18 months in particular about the spat with Acacia, the tax bill that was landed on Acacia's desk, the listing requirements for those mining companies that hold a special mining licence, the sacking of the minister, and also regulatory changes which saw increased royalties, warehousing fees, and a granting of free carried interest to the state. In terms of the sentiment in country, I was living and working in Tanzania during the regulatory changes that happened in the mining sector. They were seen anecdotally as a positive, that there was a need to recalibrate private sector investment in a way that was beneficial to the Tanzanian citizens, and particularly around the resources sector. I would say in the last 6 months in particular, not only have we seen an increase in engagement with the private sector, but we've also seen a stabilisation that's occurring. The big man politics were largely played out in the first 12 to 18 months of the president's time. He cemented himself as the CCM's man and will go forward at the 2020 elections. And we're now likely to see a high degree of stability and also predictability, with, again, as I referenced, a renewed focus on engaging with the private sector, but ensuring that the private sector realises that the expectations on it are to contribute in a meaningful way to Tanzanians. So what does this mean in terms of looking forward? His anti-corruption drive has been largely regarded domestically and also internationally as a success. This is a view which is shared largely by citizens and also the private sector, both Tanzanian private sector and foreign investors. He's cemented his power within the CCM, having not come from a large factional supporting bloc, and his popularity in the country remains strong. So I think in terms of, we can currently see him as likely to stand and win in the 2020 elections at this point, and he'll be campaigning strongly again on his anti-corruption drive, but also this new business environment in Tanzania. So when we look at what that means for the sector, I think there's going to be a differentiator between the contracts that were previously signed and the more recent contracts. Those who are seen to benefit unfairly, so the perhaps Acacias of the world, are still on the out, but I think the new wave of mining investment is seen to come at a time where there's increased transparency, increased dialogue, and there's a real belief that both the local communities and the Tanzanian government and people as a whole will be able to benefit from the mining contracts being signed now. In terms of what that means for the private sector and its stakeholder engagement, it needs to be altered. It needs to fit within the new normal. So CSR is not just an additional slide on your PowerPoint presentation. There needs to be demonstrated impacts, positive at the local level and right up to the national level. When we think about how we, and I say we as Australian companies, engage, we need to realise that we are viewed in Tanzania, as we are in many parts of the world, as world leaders in the mining sector. We need to be proud of what we are not to some extent. We don't have some of the negative legacy implications that some of our other competitors do. We need to ensure that this is reflected. I mean, Australia has a High Commission in Nairobi, and Tanzania is covered by a very strong Second Secretary who covers the region in and out of Nairobi and Tanzania. When we look at contagion and what this means, we have to compare Tanzania to its competitors in the mining sector. So if we take a look at the DRC, its neighbour, the DRC has recently seen a significant upheaval in its regulatory requirements and mining legislation. What it doesn't have, vis-a-vis Tanzania though, of course, is the prolonged security, stability, access to ports, and the significant risk that runs around both pre and post-elections. And of course, we're still asking whether or not those elections will happen. Zambia has had some troubles in terms of access to power, a president who is currently overreaching, and I think First Quantum would consider a pretty egregious tax bill. The listing requirements that we saw in Tanzania for those who hold special mining licenses are being mooted in Zimbabwe and Kenya as well. So we need to compare Tanzania for what it has: stability, security, strong institutions, a history of presidential power being passed over in a democratic and safe manner, and compare that to some of the country's regional competitors in the mining sector. So I think we can view the last 2 years of having, I would say, the first year of an increased level of unpredictability in terms of policy making. The president has cemented his position, and we're now likely to see efforts of recalibration and tweaking. But in terms of responsible investment, I think the country still has the hallmarks of what's needed to have sort of the long-term capital-intensive investments that the mining sector produces. That's my thoughts on politics and the risk profile of Tanzania. I'm sure at the end we'll do some Q&A, so if anyone would like further information.